Good morning everyone, my name's Rebecca and I'm an exercise physiologist, and this is my colleague Beck, who's an occupational therapist, and we're here representing IPA Rehabilitation.
Yeah, so at IPA, our primary role is workplace rehabilitation consultants, and what that means is we work within the workers' compensation space to help people return to work following an injury. Now, a growing part of what we're doing is moving into this early intervention space to try and help minimise the risk of those injuries before they occur, and hopefully reduce the risk of the impact on your businesses.
So today we're going to be talking about a really prevalent issue at the moment that's affecting the hospitality industry, and that's combating the rise of musculoskeletal injuries. But before we get started, IPA acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land upon which we live and work, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. We recognise that the health of our people is connected to the health of our planet, and we value access and inclusion and seek to listen, learn and build strong partnerships. We aim to provide genuine opportunities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples within our workforce and through our business. Quickly on an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. Firstly, what is body stressing? What do we mean by that? And then going into what are our risk factors and how do we assess these in the workforce? And then what are our recommendations about how we can reduce these stresses? And then putting it all into context with a few case studies, and then finally finishing off with some questions. So feel free to put some questions in the chat box along the way, and then at the end we'll address these for you. We'll just go into a definition about what NT WorkSafe describes as body stressing. So it's quite simply a collective term covering a broad range of health problems which are associated with repetitive stress and strain. So these injuries can occur from ordinary movements that we perform, such as bending, reaching, clenching, gripping, holding, twisting, all these things. And typically they occur, and we call them musculoskeletal injuries. So they can be strains, sprains, back injuries, neck injuries, tendonitis, all these sorts of things that we hear. So the median time lost per serious claim for workplace body stressing injuries is a 6-week period. So that's pretty staggering. So if we think about from a workplace perspective, can you afford to lose that worker for 6 weeks? It's not just the financial burden here, but is it going to be putting strain on the rest of the workforce? And what is it going to do to them as well?
Yeah, so we're seeing much greater increases in the costs of claims and the duration of claims, and this is a multifaceted issue, but particularly across the hospitality industry. And I think with the last 2 years, there's been some big changes, and that may be, I guess, related to COVID and some of the increased pressures, but it's definitely changing. It's definitely something to be aware of.
Absolutely. Okay, so here we can see from the NT data from Work Health and Safety 2019-2020, specific to the accommodation, cafe and restaurant industry. We can see that this industry's injury claims account for 6.5% of all NT workers' compensation claims, and at least 36% of these claims were serious, meaning that the worker needed at least 1 week off due to their injuries. In total, these injuries cost your industry 606 weeks in total time lost and $1.2 million in workers' compensation payments. So this is going to be putting a lot of additional stress on your business, both from a running day-to-day point of view, but also a financial burden. Can you afford to lose staff for this period of time, particularly someone who might hold a very significant role, such as a chef or someone front of house? Okay, so here we can see the mechanisms of injury that are causing these claims to occur. And body stressing was our main cause of injury, accounting for up to 40% of compensation claims. And almost half of those were serious. So as I mentioned before, serious claims mean that the worker needs at least 1 week off due to their injuries. And the main incident types that are causing these body stress injuries were muscular stress while lifting, carrying or putting down objects. So these are often our acute injuries. And the other one is muscular stress while handling objects other than lifting, carrying or putting down. And so these are often our repeat strain injuries that are occurring there. But the NT data shows, on top of all, that the back was the main body area injured. The majority of our body stressing injuries are occurring in the accommodation sector, followed by cafes and restaurants. And there is a number of reasons why this may be the case, and we'll help to provide further insight using a case study example later in the presentation. So just to summarise here, we often know the hazards of slips, trips and falls, and we're very good at putting things in place to stop these from occurring. But what if we have in place at the moment to address body stressing? It's the biggest factor influencing the amount of claims that are happening, but is the same level of effort and attention there to address the root cause of these problems? When we talk about body stressing, it's a categorical term that we use to describe work-related musculoskeletal injuries. So these can affect any worker. It's not just our labour-intensive workers out there in construction. It can be someone in a cafe, someone typing, a cleaner, you name it. Anyone can get body stressing injuries. As we've spoken about before, the median time lost for these serious claims as a whole, it's 6 weeks, and that's a median. So we've got to think about, can we afford to have that worker away for that length of time? Who needs to pick up the slack while they're gone?
What's all the other costs on the businesses associated with those claims?
Absolutely. So poor habits performed repetitively over time is our biggest issue here. So often we hear about the straw that broke the camel's back. So it's something that's performed routinely over a number of years, potentially in a not ideal setting, and then just one day, bang, the back's gone, and then we've got an injury that's unfortunately happened in the workplace. So moving on to the next slide. We've got a few examples here of the musculoskeletal injuries that we see, but importantly here we're seeing a lot of back injuries that are occurring and associated issues. So sometimes it can be, how often do we see someone come in that's reported, I had this niggling pain for a while, and then all of a sudden, they're presenting with this really serious back pain.
Almost every day.
Yeah. So it's an accumulation of X, Y, and Z, then we get this injury. So body stressing, again, is a big, big factor in this. A bit more of a summary, just in case you haven't got the picture already, that back pain is a massive issue. It's the single leading cause of disability, preventing many people from engaging in the workforce. So up to 80% of the population will experience back pain at some point in their lives, and it's one of the biggest reasons for people going to their GP. And obviously you can see that there's a massive portion of money that's going into back pain, and with that, a massive loss of productivity as well.
I guess with a lot of what Beck's been saying, so we know that back pain's a problem, we know that body stressing is a problem, and we know it's a growing risk both inside and outside the workplace. But as an employer and as sort of a member of this workforce, it's our job to look at what we can do to make sure people are safe, at least while they're at work. Everyone has a right to go to work and come home safely, and I think that's one of the really important parts.
Absolutely.
So what can we actually do to assess the risk and find out more about what's specifically happening in our workforce to reduce that risk of injury and help try and keep our workers safe? So a big part of what we talk about is doing regular risk assessments. And so risk assessments are basically a proactive process that helps you respond to change and helps facilities to continuously improve the businesses and make sure there's a planned and systematic response. A risk assessment involves considering whatever could happen to a worker and when someone's exposed to a hazard. Often we're really good at identifying the big ticket items, so exposure to sharps or the burns risks or the slips, trips and falls, which are really, I guess, things that we do need to be aware of. But the body stressing and the musculoskeletal injuries are something that's much harder to predict and something that requires a little bit more thought and processing. So like Beck talked about, it's such an important part to include in your risk assessments. We're looking at the longevity of these claims, the high cost of these claims, and the frequencies of these injuries increasing within the hospitality space. And so it's really crucial that including these musculoskeletal disorders and including body stressing injuries is an important part of your risk assessment process. Basically, a good risk assessment and a good risk assessment process should help you determine how severe the risk is. Is it a paper cut or is it a 12-month back injury? Whether or not there are existing control measures and how effective these are, and whether or not the actions you take can actually control the risk, and how urgently those actions need to be taken. So what's the point of this? So a safe and healthy workplace doesn't always happen by chance. It's important that employers do whatever they can to make sure that they're providing reasonably practical solutions to eliminate or minimise that risk of injury. So we know that a risk management process involves 4 main steps, and that includes identifying the hazards. So what are the tasks that are most likely to expose your workers to injury? So that can be looking at what times of day they're most likely to be injured. Is it when they're really fatigued at the end of the shift? Or is it when, certain times of the month when you get this certain delivery in and there's a lot more work to do on that day? Actually assess the risk. So understand what's the nature of the harm that can be caused. It's something that involves a lot of scrubbing and sort of highly repetitive actions that's going to lead to injuries like a tennis elbow, which might not necessarily be a one-off heavy task, but over time, we're going to see those overuse injuries start to occur. Or is it something like moving the keg, which we know is a high-risk task and has a very high risk of back injury if it's done inappropriately? Looking at how you can control the risks. So the processes should guide us to implement the most effective controls to manage these risks and manage them over time to make sure there is an accumulative effect on the body and we're minimising those risks of overuse injuries. And then constantly reviewing these hazards. The risk management process isn't a once-off process. It doesn't need to be done once every 2 and 3 years. It should be continuous and it should be a normal part of your system's operations. So I mentioned reasonably practical before, and that's a word that's used often in the legislation, and it means, making sure that what you're doing is you're providing the highest level of protection that is reasonable and practical for your business. And so that involves looking at what the degree of harm is. Obviously, if there's a very high risk of harm and severe harm, it's really important to action that one immediately and urgently, and there needs to be high degrees of control. Looking at what ways are actually available to minimise that risk, looking at the availability of those ways, and then also the costs on the business, because it's important to make sure you're doing what's going to keep your business running, but also minimising that risk as well. So our approach to risk management involves a number of steps. So engaging with all parties, and this is the most important step I feel in the process and something that we really emphasise with employers. So making sure that all workers from the very base level to your middle management, senior management, executives are involved in that process, making sure everyone has input and everybody has ownership over the process. And starting with that at the beginning is a really, really crucial part. Making sure that you understand your workplace, and there are so many different ways to understand it and gain that knowledge of your workplace, but making sure you sit down and start from the beginning. Working through these risk assessments is really important, and there's a number of different standardised tools, assessment processes that you can use to do that. Making sure that you're providing recommendations. And so providing recommendations too is important to be done at, again, that level where you started with. So looking at the workers, looking at the middle management, looking at the senior management, and making sure everyone's involved and has ownership over those recommendations. And that's going to make a much more sustainable change and also help with the culture of safety in the workplace, which we'll talk about a bit later, but it's a really important part of making sure that your workplace is safe. And then review, constantly review. I can't emphasize enough of how much this needs to be an ongoing process, and there'll never be that one quick fix. If we start with the basics, so how to talk to your workers. So talking to your workers should always be the first step in the process. Starting with the basics of, are they involved? Do they feel safe? Do they feel comfortable talking to you about what they see, both in an informal and formal settings? Not only this, but do they want to be involved? How do you get that buy-in to make sure that people are wanting to be heard, making sure that they want ownership over the safety processes? Now, it's important for your employees to feel heard and feel safe, and making them, speak up about the risks they see. If they don't speak up, you're not going to be able to do an adequate risk assessment to start with, and that involves just having simple questions. So, how do you feel today? How do you feel at the end of the day? Do you have any pain at the moment? Do you have any discomforts? Those real little questions will help open up the doors and start this risk assessment process.
So I think also if we take it back to looking at it as a 3-pronged approach here. So what you've talked about there is firstly with the individual. So Beck, do you want to explain a little bit more about the table that we can see here and how it all comes together to combine as a risk altogether.
Yeah, so this sort of set of circles is what we use as an allied health coming into a workplace, and would always base our assessment on these three things. So the personal factors, so that's looking at the profile of your workforce and individual workers. Do they have certain risks? Do they have risks that they're willing to tell you about? You know the obvious ones. If you have an aging workforce. If there's a big rate of smoking in your workforce. The unhealthy patterns. But the things like the pre-existing injuries, is that something they're comfortable to tell you about? But knowing your workforce and knowing the personal factors is a huge part of it. Then we look at the environment. So the environment includes everything external to the worker, external to the task. And so there's the big things that we're really good at assessing, such as slips, slippery floors, the time of day, heat, those sorts of things that often are really obvious and really lead to fatigue and increased risks of injuries. But it's also the more dynamic tasks. So what's happening at different times of day in your business is, are you a cafe and you have certain rush times, and are those rush times going to cause a greater risk of injury, or is there a greater frequency of injury within those times? And then looking at the specific task factors. So the task is everything involved in the physical movements, what elements of the task are most likely to lead to the greatest risk. So, for example, housekeepers and cleaning staff, we often see injuries around changing the bed. And so what elements of changing the sheets on the bed make it a higher risk of injury? What do you know about how easy it is to push the bed out from the side of the wall? How easy is it to lift up the mattress? All these task-specific factors can increase and decrease the risk of injury in your workplace. Understanding your workplace. So other great tools to use are things like your injury claims data, looking at your incident reports, looking at your near miss reports. Are you keeping track of your near misses? They're a great way to encourage employees to speak up. Employees to speak up. They're a great way to, get that information that you might otherwise miss. And they can be done easily in toolbox meetings, simple surveys, things like that. But anything you can do to gather that information will help lead to this risk of it's sort of risk assessment process. Looking at past assessments is also really important. What's been done previously, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's also a great, wealth of knowledge online, in that I can almost guarantee you can find similar risk assessments or see what people have done in the past all online. And so start with the basics. Don't make it harder on yourself. Do the important steps first. Get the information, get the knowledge, understand your workplace, and then tailor it to yourself. But don't reinvent the wheel. I really think it's important you guys do make it easy for yourselves. And then, like we said before, it's, doing these assessments once every 2 and 3 years is really not enough. It needs to be that continuous process, and you need to be looking at what's constantly changing in your workplace as well.
I know there's some great resources on the NT WorkSafe website as well. So always good to have a look there at a first point of call.
Definitely a good starting point. So if we now look at manual tasks, so when we're looking at tasks, we're going to look at what are the highest risks within that component. So what are the specific task factors? Forceful exertion. So this could be something as simple as pushing open a heavy door or pushing a laundry trolley. All these movements that might put people in situations that lead to extra fatigue or an increased burden, increased load. Looking at awkward postures, often we see things in a lot of bar staff where they're reaching in under tables, low heights, awkward reaching over postures. Vibrations to the hand and body is also a big risk factor. So things like even using a coffee machine, pushing a vacuum, adds that increased risk of vibrations, which then leads to increased muscle fatigue, increased risk of injury. The duration of a task is another really important thing, and the repetition of that task. We know that the more likely or the more frequent people do these tasks and the longer duration they do them for, the greater the risk of injury. And that comes down to a muscle fatigue thing. So tasks that they're going to do throughout the entire shift, if you've got someone, even doing something really simple like operating a bar tap, if they're constantly pulling that movement with their wrist, it becomes a repetitive movement. Even though it's something that might be really light and you might not think is a great risk, anything that's that repetitive movement all day for an 8-hour shift can become, a big risk factor for people. And it's important to consider that. About the specific risk assessment tools that we use. This tool here is called the ruler, and it assesses specific upper limb movements. But there's a number of different tasks that you can use, and it's important to use validated tools to make sure you're giving yourselves the best data. Using wearable technology is another great option, and I'll talk about that next, but making sure that you're using as many different tools as you can. Looking at worker input and ways of gathering worker input, such as worker discomfort surveys, is really important. And also looking at the psychosocial stuff. So the stuff that might not be specifically related to the injury, but all the psychosocial stuff. We know that workers who are happier in their workplaces have much lower risks of injuries. So looking at wellbeing surveys, looking at how your workers are feeling throughout the day, throughout the week, is really important too. And there's a number of tools online. It's also something that you can enlist people like us to help with, and we can help find the tools that are going to be most valuable to your workplace. But like I said before, make life easier for yourselves. Don't reinvent the wheel. Use the validated tools that are already out there, and use it as a big component of your risk assessment. Now about wearable technology. I just wanted to include this slide because it's a question we get all the time, and there's a lot of benefits to it. I think wearable technology is a great aid, but I think it's really important to remember that it is a tool. Buying a piece of wearable technology isn't necessarily going to reduce that risk of injury. It needs to be used as part of the assessment process, and it needs to be used, I guess, in conjunction with other things and with someone who's appropriately analysing that data in order to best inform your workforce and best inform the risk assessment process. We know a task is heavy. We know certain things are going to be heavy. Just using that data from the accelerometer to tell us that isn't really enough. So I really think it is a great step, and I think it's a really great tool, but I think it does need to be used in conjunction with other tools as well. Other tools that we use regularly can be things like a job task analysis. So a job task analysis is, I guess, a description of how the tasks can be carried out in particular. And so they're often done by people with an allied health background. And they look at the environment, the individual components of the task, and the cognitive demands involved in that task as well. So the job task analysis is a great tool to be used within the risk assessment process, but it's also a great tool to be used within doing pre-employment assessments, assessing ongoing fitness for work, working return to work programs, and working in other manual handling or, I guess, strengthening programs within the workplace. So it's a great tool to be used without the career of the employee, from start to finish. So the next tool that we use a lot of is the Perform tool. So the Perform tool is a way of sort of encompassing everything I've talked about previously. It's a tool that was developed by Queensland, Work Health and Safety Queensland, the University of Queensland, and Curtin University of Technology. And it's basically a thorough risk assessment process as such, and we can apply it to all different sort of workplaces, situations, scenarios. It's based on the theories of participative ergonomics, and has a range of benefits to help reduce the risk of musculoskeletal injuries, and there's quite a bit of research behind it. It's a great tool to be used again in conjunction with other things, but it's something that we use fairly regularly as a way to guide our risk assessments when we come into processes. So I'd really recommend having a look into what's going on in the world of participative ergonomics at the moment. If we now look at what we can actually do about those risks. So you've done your risk assessment, what's next?
All right, so our recommendations. So if we get the next slide up, we can see we've got an inverted pyramid here. So at the top, we've got elimination. So this could often be the hardest way to mitigate a risk, but it is the best way. Under that, if we can't get rid of the risk, can we substitute it or mitigate it for an alternative? And then next, moving down, we have engineering. Can we change the way that we do things, whether it be rearranging the workflow of a packing area? Can we reduce the carrying distances? Other equipment suggestion to minimise the load on the body or the strain over time. So some really practical examples of this is putting the wheels on something. Can we use a trolley instead of carrying an item? Can we use levers instead? Can we increase the length of that lever to make the load on the body less? So moving down, we have the administrative changes that we can make. Are we training staff in risk assessment? And this really needs to be specific to the job and very job site specific here, and their responsibilities of the worker. So this isn't just manual handling training. This is looking into the specific equipment. Can we look at more frequent task rotations? and improving the use of that equipment to eliminate the risk. And also looking at the staff lifting capacity. Joe Blow is going to be able to lift differently to Beck. And, how are we going to manage that in the workplace? There's no right or wrong here, but it's just something we need to consider. And then lastly, in our inverted pyramid, we have PPE. So we've seen that most recently with masks, with the COVID situation we have. So this is really up to the workers and the workforce, middle management, upper management to implement the use of PPE. If we can't get rid of the risk, we have to protect against it. So this is our last line of defence, really, in terms of mitigating risk. Manual handling training is still a really important part of reducing the risk of work-related musculoskeletal disorders, but it's not our sole focus here. There's no right or wrong way to lift, to carry or push or pull, and it's context specific. We need to be able to get our body and our joints in the best possible position to be able to do that lift numerous times over and over. One principle that we like to use is called our circle of strength, and that's to do with our base of support and keeping the load nice and close to our body, regardless of whether we can use the idealistic principles for every single lift. So again, there's no right or wrong way, but it's about lifting the strongest way possible for that worker. And not being biased here as an exercise physiologist, but there is a lot of research that's come out most recently that's in favour of strength training exercises and programs within the workplace to improve the general conditioning of our workers, but also increasing morale, good workplace culture. All of these things have great offshoots of
it's a huge component of where we're going.
Absolutely. So moving on, not just our training, but we need to look at the culture and involvement of the workplace. So manual handling training and these risk assessments need to be practical and workshop-based. We need to focus on risk identification, and early reporting is a really, I can't stress it enough, and Beck has as well here. We do need to be aware of those personal risk factors and just acknowledging with ourselves, Beck mentioned numerous risk factors there of, is it an ageing population? Is it a group of young mums that we've got? Is it young kids that are balancing their homework and school life as well? What are the added stresses that are on these people? And going through that together. We can incorporate wearable technology, but definitely where appropriate. Pardon the pun. Most importantly here though is listening to the feedback from your staff members. It's really important because if one person is voicing that concern, it's likely that it's going to be shared by others as well. So really actively listening to what's coming in, what's being told by your workers. So moving on to early reporting, we can't ignore the warning signs that your employees may be experiencing. And these can include discomfort or pain, even if it goes away after work or if it's just a little niggling feeling. Are they feeling overwhelmed or stressed? And that's where those wellbeing assessments really come into play, and we're going to find out a little bit more information there. Are they tired? I know this hot weather that we're going through at the moment, I don't know if everyone knows, but there's a heat wave in Darwin. But is that contributing to fatigue and stress? Are people concentrating? Have they got other things on their mind that are taking them away from the task at hand at work? We need to create a culture within the workplace that addressing these issues and going to your managers with problems isn't a sign of weakness. And having an approachable, safe space for your workers is really, really key. So a big thing that we see is that sometimes workers can go straight to their GP or the medical practitioners with these problems rather than going to the employer first and saying, look, I've got this issue. And so we need to kind of flip that in reverse, don't we, Beck?
It's huge. The number of, claims we see that weren't handled correctly in the first 24, 48 hours. And I think that could have made a huge difference to the outcomes of the claim. We're seeing them 12, 18 months down the track. And if they were handled or treated differently and they had a better response from their employer in that 24 hours, I don't think would be where we are now.
Absolutely. So some points to remember here about workplace first aid. So I'm not just talking about the Band-Aids that we put on if there's a little cut. We this is the workplace injuries or the body stressing injuries particularly. As employers, we need to be calm and listen to the worker and offer reassurance. First aid, RISA. And everyone remember what RISA stands for? So we need to use these principles to help manage the outcome of that injury, and it's crucial within those first 24 to 48 hours. If we're not following those first aid principles acutely, then our injury outcomes be a whole lot worse, and we're definitely seeing that in the occupational rehab space. We've got a number of hotlines listed here, and your workplace will have employee assistance programs as well, but these are really important to be aware of because it's not just musculoskeletal injuries that we're talking about. It's mental health issues, it's family issues. They all contribute to stresses, and then unfortunately it ends up coming out as a body stressing injury at times. So we really need to remember to follow the basics, follow the principles, follow your workplace policies and procedures when there is an injury. Maybe those policies and procedures need to be reviewed and updated with a changing workforce. So these are all things to consider. But importantly, if we can, we want that worker to remain at work. There's a little bit of a culture of, oh, that person's hurt themselves, let's send them home and let them rest at home. But as soon as they go home, do we know what they're doing?
Are they safe to drive home? Have you asked these questions of what are they going to do when they get home? Do they have someone to help them with the first aid at home?
Yeah, do they have a plan? Are they going to go to their doctor? And so from there, the following day, checking in with that worker, we need to find suitable light duties, if appropriate for that worker, that are safe and a safe alternative for them to do. And it's up to the employer to provide alternate duties as a responsibility and as a duty of care to that worker.
For sure. We know that, I guess, with injuries at the moment, the research shows that by keeping people moving and by people sort of maintaining their healthy movement patterns, they're going to have much faster rates of recovery than, say, resting at home or lying in bed and reducing that movement. So making sure that, I guess, you're providing a safe workplace. So don't I guess putting them back in high-risk situations isn't going to help, but allowing them to keep moving and keeping involved in the workplace will have much greater, I guess, return to work rates, reduce those timeframes on that injury, and reduce the risk of potential claims as well.
Absolutely. And, we've got the musculoskeletal recovery process, but was there, as part of the incident that happened, was it a stressful incident? Are there mental health considerations that we need to take into account here, as well as just the musculoskeletal recovery process? So moving on to debriefing. So this is really important to not only debrief with the worker on the day and support them then, but following the incident, the day after, listening to their concerns, discussing with them what went wrong on that day, what went right, and then from there, developing a plan together of how we're going to move forward to address those risks and reduce the likelihood of it happening again to that worker, but also everyone else as well in the workplace. And then providing those contact numbers which were listed on the slide previous. But ultimately in that box there on the right, you can see highlighted in blue, it's really about being heard. We want our workers to feel like they're engaged in the process of a recovery, and if they do have a claim put in through workers' compensation, then they need to be engaged in that process and to feel heard.
Yeah, I think people forget how much pain changes your brain. Feeling pain, you'll just have that discomfort, you're extra tired, you feel disempowered, you feel a loss of control, over your body, but then often over the situation. We know the workers' comp system can be a really scary process for people. So everything you can do to empower your workers, make sure they have that control over their life, give them that power back, I think will greatly help with return to work outcomes and reduce that risk of injury. And have that safe space. It's about having that culture of, that people can come talk to you early because you do action it appropriately.
So now we're going to put this all into context with a couple of case studies. So case study 1, we have Mary. So she's a 54-year-old housekeeper. So in this instance, she's presented to the employer with a letter from her doctor saying that she's not able to do any lifting and she can't use a vacuum cleaner. Just a little bit of background, she has no previous reports of pain made to the employer. So Beck, what do you think, using an approach of what could we have done before, during and after for this particular case study? So starting with, what actions could we have done before to help prevent this injury from occurring?
Yeah, so I think this is something we've seen quite often. It's something that I guess it aggravates employers quite a lot, because they always come to us and say, like, if we knew, we would have done something about it. But how do you know? And so what you do before, so have there been informal reports made? You know, has she talked to friends about it and nobody's reported? Nobody's encouraging that reporting of injuries or pain or increased discomfort. Was it something that she maybe has discussed with a manager and they haven't filed it appropriately? Is it something where she doesn't feel safe? Are there extra things going on? You know, is there language barriers? Is there things that, I guess, she really wants this job, she needs this job, she doesn't want to cause an issue for you, she doesn't want it to be harder for you, and she actually wants to support you guys, but she just doesn't feel safe. And then obviously she's gone to the doctor and the doctor's issued this letter. Is there actually something wrong that, you know, was unsafe at the time? Is there faulty equipment that's not being reported? It's really critical that you start this risk assessment now to really investigate what did happen before and what you could have done to, I guess, change it. And most of the time, it's about increasing that communication, increasing that culture. The psychosocial effect of injuries is huge. So having all that, I guess, global approach to the injury rather than just looking at the musculoskeletal factors and that real manual factors is really important there.
All right, so we've got all that background information. She's come to us with this letter from the GP. What are the immediate actions that the employer should take from there?
Well, I guess my biggest thing is, you know, how did you respond when they brought that letter? I can almost guarantee you will never get that letter at a time that's really good for you. It'll be when you're at your busiest, when you're, I guess, rushing to get 101 things done that need to be out the door. Someone brings you this letter and your response probably isn't what it would be at your best. But it's so important to address it appropriately. You know, sit down with the worker, take that time to sit down and see how she's going. Is she actually feeling okay? Asking someone if they're okay is often forgotten, and I think we all know that, and we all know that deep down, but just remembering that your first response should always be, are you okay? When someone brings you a letter like this. Yeah, break it down.
All right, and so then following that, what are the steps that we need to take moving on to help support Mary in her graded return to work or transitional return to work?
So I guess look at what's actually going on for her. So is there a diagnosis? Can you have that meeting with the doc and find out what's been happening? Talk to Mary, talk to the staff, talk to everybody to see what's been happening. Is there something we can do as an easy fix? Can we eliminate that hazard and reduce it completely? Or is it something that's going to take a bit more, research, a bit more effort to really change those processes? But then involve Mary in that process. The more involved a worker is in that return to work process, in that risk assessment process, making sure she's A, feeling heard, and B, feeling that there's something being done about the injury or what's been causing those problems, the better off the outcome's going to be for everybody. And making sure that, I guess, it's a constructive process. You know, nobody should ever feel that fear of coming to you with an injury, and no one should ever feel that they're being remanded for an injury. It's a no-fault system we've got under the workers' comp system. So making sure that A, she's safe, A, she feels included, or B, she feels included. And I guess lastly, you have that collaborative approach moving forward. If further support is needed, I guess that's where the workplace rehab providers are really helpful, in that we can help navigate the communication barriers, we can help do that assessment and provide that extra set of eyes to really help address that problem and help sort of get back to work if it's going to be a more complicated injury.
Absolutely. All right, so moving on to case study 2, we have a 25-year-old bartender. He gets a sharp pain in his lower back, particularly when lifting from low shelving. A review of injury report and other data, from that we can see a high proportion of similar injuries in this area of work of bartenders at this particular establishment. So in this instance, what do you think we can do, looking at that inverted pyramid, to help support this worker to prevent further progression of the injury into becoming a serious back complaint?
Well, I guess the basics in that there's a bit of workplace redesign that we can do here, and I think it's really important to look at how your workplace is set up and what we can do to help reduce those risks. So are things at bench height? Are the bottles of wine that are most frequently accessed at the most accessible location? Is the really heavy things up on the top shelves? What can we do to move things to that bench level height so it is easier to lift and easier to reach? Ask the workers and get them involved in how they would like to design that setup. There's sometimes we can control it, sometimes we can't, but they will know exactly what they're doing. They'll know what, I guess, is causing them problems, what they have difficulty accessing, and when they're using those awkward postures. So I guess having that look at really the design process and what can you do to eliminate those risks of the really low lifting and the really high lifting is going to be an important one there. When we look at when someone comes to you with that sort of complaint, do they have a normal incident or do they have an incident reporting process? Have they filled out the right incident report? Making sure that those sorts of things are documented so that when you are doing that risk assessment process, it gets, I guess, added into that process correctly and accurately.
That's a really nice summary. And this is an instance where we can really utilise the substitution or the engineering aspects of that inverted pyramid. There's some really nifty trolleys that we can use, carrying devices, lever arms. Can we change where the delivery is being put within the establishment to reduce the carry time for these workers? All right, so moving on, just to summarise, I think, some really big points that we need to make here is that early intervention is key. We need to identify the risks of workplace musculoskeletal injuries to prevent them from happening in the first place. If they do happen, we need to engage the worker and make them feel heard and involved in the recovery process for them for ideal recovery at this stage.
Yeah, remembering that the first 24 to 48 hours is super important. So having that opportunity to debrief and sit down with your workers is critical. And then I guess the big thing of having a continuous risk assessment process. It'll be invaluable for your workplace and making sure that it's tailored to you. There's a lot of different tools out there. There's a million and one people who are doing it. So making sure that you're making it easy for yourself and using the tools that are already out there to find what's going to suit your workplace. Did we want to go into sort of questions now? Is there any questions that are coming through?
All right, so we've got a question here about the circle of strength. So basically, if we think about the body and the immediate space around the body as a circle around us, an imaginary ring, and so that is our circle of strength. So when we want to carry a load, for example, imagine this is a box. We want to keep it as close to our circle of strength as possible. So ideally holding it nice and close, but also that means if we're lifting it from the ground, we're not reaching forward, we're keeping our body on top of the object, maybe doing a nice squat or a lunge around that object to keep it within that circle of strength for us.
Generally, the circle of strength we describe as about so the length of your elbow to your fingertips away from your body. And that's generally because it keeps the muscles within that, I guess, the mid-range point when your muscles are also stronger. The example I always give when I do, I guess, training around it is we've all had the competitions where everyone holds out the stein for as long as they possibly can. It's Oktoberfest, so you might see it. But obviously everyone can hold a stein nice and close drinking. It doesn't take too much effort, but it's actually a competition and a lot of physical strength to hold that stein out at full arm's length away from your body for as long as possible. And that's because it is putting that extra load on your muscles. So bringing that in will make it much easier and allow you to drink a lot more beer, essentially.
So I hope that answers the question with a great example. Yeah. That's right. It's not a question, but it's a thank you very much for the informative session. Thanks, Karen.
Thanks so much for your time. I hope we've answered a lot of your questions and provided a bit of different insight into how we see musculoskeletal injuries and body stressing injuries in the workforce.
I think really importantly, we need to think about this is not just a silo of workplace injuries, body stressing injuries, in that how can we engage workplace health and wellbeing and our culture within the workplace to try and mitigate these risks. We know if workers are happier and healthier, we're less likely to see injuries in these people. So having those policies and actions in place is really going to be beneficial for your workforce in the long term.
We might end it there.
Yeah.
Thanks for dialing in, everyone, and have a great day.